Hi, in this video we're going to walk through the VR Weapon Interactor Unity asset available on the Unity Asset Store. I'm going to walk through the editors and setting up a new weapon from scratch. Okay, so let's start by looking at some of the guns that we have in the example scene and seeing how they're set up. So we'll start on left to right with the basic weapon. So this weapon is set up to use a laser pointer, it has an integrated magazine, and it doesn't use a slide. So you can see that it has a parent object with just the rigid body on it, and this script called VR Gun Handler Ref. All this does is link to the actual gun handler script, which is on the gun handler object. It's on its own object. This is the sort of center script for the entire thing. And on any of these scripts, you see that you open gun handler editor button. It's on here, and it's also on here. Opening that up will show you the main window for modifying all of the settings for each gun. And in this video we're going to go through pretty much everything here and see it all working. So let's start off by just looking through the objects and how this the anatomy of this object's put together. So first we just have a few mesh renderers. Because obviously these aren't moving parts, they're just mesh renderers left on their own, and it's the this and this, and that makes up the whole gun. Now the gun handler script, you can see that the gun handler script inherits from the VR interactable item script, and usually when that happens I put this little line here, and you see all the normal VR interactable item variables are below that, and then the variables that are to do with just the thing that's inherited from it go just above. So for example, the gun handler adds on to the interactable item by adding a slide and trigger reference, and in this case also has the editor button. Here we have the slide. It has a simple animation that I put on it, and we can see on the animation tab here, you can actually see that animation playing. It's just that, just a simple back and forth, and I'll show you where that's called later. So here we have the colliders. Now I've separated out all the colliders, so you see that this mesh renderer, it's just the mesh, it's not the collider. Because the object is a little bit complex, I could potentially have added a mesh collider onto this object, but it's a little bit nicer to add all the colliders as separate little box colliders here. Now anytime you ever see a collider, we always have to have a VR item collider script to it, and that always references the interactable item. And obviously the gun handler, like I said, inherits from the interactable item, so that's the thing that's referenced. Just referencing this script. And all these scripts are not triggers, so they're actually the item, and that's how it is as far as the world is concerned. Anytime you have a collider on its own like this, and it's a child of a rigid body, it treats all of the colliders as its body. So all of these work together and don't collide with each other and become one solid object. So that's a good way of making fairly complex rigid body objects. We got some IK targets. So these are just empty transforms that are referenced, and they're used if you are using an IK setup like Final IK to position the actual hands over where they're supposed to be. The trigger uses a nice little trigger script here. It's got some options here. You'll see this kind of setup quite often. So all it does is store a default position and rotation and a pulled position and rotation. And it's looking at where it is currently in the scene. So I can toggle between these two positions, and you can see that the transform gets changed. If I were to say move this position here and set that to be a new current pulled, you see that this number gets updated when it's changed enough. And then when I toggle between them, it's toggling between the two new positions. So I'll move that back, and that's about right for a trigger moving. I also have this little boolean down here, which can be used for, say, the revolver. I have a revolver back here, and actually on this particular weapon, the hammer back here, which also you'll notice that I have the hammer script, and then as a child I actually have the mesh. That's a fairly good thing, just so you can add things like a little offset, like I have a little rotation offset here. Just good practice. You don't need to do this. For instance, you could have this mesh filter and mesh renderer actually on the same object as the script, and this works for most of the scripts. Now I've ticked it on this one because what this says is that when it hits the pulled position, it's going to immediately go back to the default position, and that's what you basically expect with the hammer of a gun like this. Okay, the next thing is the magazine. Now, because this is an integrated magazine, you see that on here we have can be held actually set to false. So again, this is kind of a complicated object. It's the magazine. we've got a few different scripts, and like I said before, we've got these little lines that sort of show what's happening. So at the bottom here, you see that everything's inherited from VR Interactable item. The magazine is an item, but then the item is inherited by VR attachment, because the magazine can be an attachment. In this case, it's actually not, because it's integrated, but most magazines can be an attachment. But then also, it's not just an attachment, it's a magazine, so that inherits from the attachment script. So you can see that it's that's how the variables are sort of split up between these little segments. So all attachments will have these variables, and all items have these variables, but just magazines have these variables. And the fact that it's integrated, it's just, you can see that can be held is actually false. And we also have here an attachment receiver. Every magazine has to have an attachment receiver. I've just set the position to be really small. It's just there because the magazine inherits from an attachment, so all attachments have to have an attachment receiver. Okay, so let's open up the actual editor itself and have a look at what we have to go through. Okay, so we can pretty much ignore weapon position. It's never going to be, it's not particularly relevant. The first thing that you'll probably want to do when setting up a new weapon is set up the weapon held position. When you click that, it's going to open up this brand new little box here. And this held position box works the same way it does on any other item. And you can set up the actual position that it's held in reference to the controller there. The second held collider, this particular one doesn't have one, but if we go to a weapon, I should also mention that all the weapons use the same editor. So they're all based on the same scripts, the same editor. So if we go to this one that does have a second held collider, we'll see on this object, very, very similar layout. You know, it's got more attachment receivers, but still gun handler, it's the same script, it's the same stuff, and you'll find that on all of them. They're all based on the same scripts, the same base stuff, and the same editor. So here you see that it does have a second held collider, it's referenced right here, and it's referencing this object, which has a VR second held script on it, and as a child it's got some IK positions for the inverse kinematics, because when you want to hold the barrel you have to have a particular position. And you can see this again, it inherits from VR Interactable item, and then above it is the variables just for the second held, and in this case, second held positions, what they can do is override the recoil when the second held is held. And you can also set those variables actually inside the editor here. They're just matched, they just use the same variables. Like if I show 0.5, if I up this number, you can see that it increases in both places. It's just showing the variables twice. So because it has a second held collider, these extra options have shown up down here. Like if you look, so you have recoil recovery, then second held recoil recovery. But on a weapon like this pistol over here, where it doesn't have one, it does recoil, and then it doesn't have the second held because it's not referenced, so the extra options aren't there. So if you want to add a second held collider, you can just click the Add Second Held Collider button, and it will actually make you a brand new object here that we can reset, that we can select first, and see that it's just added a VR second held collider. Now it's added a trigger for us, but we can actually remove that, we don't need it. And then all we need to do is actually position this where we'd want it, say here, and now if you'd held there as a second held, it will improve your aiming and affect these recoil numbers. But for the pistol, we don't have a second held, so we'll remove that for now, and remove the actual new object that was made. The weapon firing mode, there's a few different modes to pick from, 5 of them. Semi-automatic is standard for a pistol, so every time you fire, it will, the next one available, each time you click the trigger. Fully automatic, it'll just keep firing as long as the trigger's held. There's a little tooltip here that tells you exactly what they do. Again, 3 burst, pump, we'll look at those in a bit. But semi-automatic for the pistol, this assault rifle is fully automatic. This is bolt action or pump, so you see that one right here. Like it says here, it just means that you need to pull the slide or pump the shotgun in order for the next round to actually be loaded. So we could say this pistol, and it's semi-automatic now, we could just put it to fully automatic, and now it's a machine gun pistol, just as simple as that. We've got some variables here, just some simple variables, damage, bullet force, so it adds this force to any rigid body of an object it hits, the kick of the recoil. This is the default recoil, obviously if you have a second held, you get the extra options here. Now we got one of the toggles here, require magazine to shoot. If you, this is unticked, which means, obviously it doesn't matter for this particular gun, but say this gun that does have a removable magazine, and on this gun it's also not ticked. That basically means that if there's a chambered bullet So if you use a chambered bullet and you remove the magazine, the chambered bullet's still there. If you tick this, you can't actually fire the chambered bullet unless the magazine is inserted. Depends on what you're doing. I think actually for certain pistols, I'm pretty sure for the actual M9 this probably should be ticked, because I'm pretty confident, I'm not 100%, but for certain guns you can't fire the chambered bullet when the magazine isn't in. But for this one you can, just because it's just a toggle. The shoot origin, so you'll want to set this up for any new gun. If you click set up shoot origin, you'll see that it's actually made two spheres in the scene. And you can see that the sphere's positions, their local position, local to the root object, is here. And we've got this the origin and the direction. So these two spheres will probably be on 0, 0 and on top of each other when you first make a brand new gun. And you just want to position them like this, where the origin comes from, where the bullet's going to come from, and the directions just references, is just the direction from the origin. So in this case, it's just drawing a line pointing at the way the gun would shoot this way. You can change the shot mode. This is so single shot, correct for a pistol. You can also change it to machine gun spread, and that would be good for, let's say, this assault rifle. If you just want to add a little bit of randomness, a spread randomness, and then you have the shotgun spread that works like you'd think. Each bullet will fire multiple ones in a cone, and the shotgun's an example of a weapon that uses that. Okay, that's the shoot direction. Now the raycast layers. We're not actually using any in the example scene, but this is just our list of strings. And just like the tooltips try and say here, you can either say a list of layers that you want to ignore, or it's a list of layers that you only want to hit. And so you can use these raycast layers if you have, say, triggers in the scene that you don't want bullets to hit, then you can add that layer onto here and make sure it ignores just that layer, and make sure all your trigger colliders are on a specific layer. Maybe you have something on the player controller, like a hitbox for the player, and if you drag the gun too close to yourself, obviously it's colliding with that. You can make sure to set the actual gun colliders to be on a different layer, and make sure that the damage raycast layers only hit hitboxes and such like that. The next one, here's what I was saying before about the hammer. So I've referenced, this is play animations on fire, and so it's just a list of animations, and every time the gun fires it will just play the animation. So in this case the hammer will play its little simple animation every time it's fired. So you can either use a system like that where it's playing an animation, or you can use the system like I've got here where it does not play an animation on fire. In fact, the hammer is just using the trigger script, the gun trigger script, with this ticked. And all the gun trigger script actually does is look at where the trigger on the controller is and move it between the default position rotation and pull position rotation, and back and forth. It doesn't actually have anything to do with firing of the gun. It's just a visual script just for the trigger. That's all that does. Next thing is hovers. So for this gun, say we have quite a few hovers, just 4. And you see that if I click each one, it's the mesh, the main mesh of the gun. It's this one. Then the hammer. So you see, even so, the hammer is an animation in private. You can just reference it here so that it shows up. You want to basically make all of the objects that you want to hover. For things like, for external parts, like say the magazine, that's an external thing. It on its own, here's a magazine object. It has a magazine script here, the VR magazine, and it also has its hover thing, which is just one in this case, just itself, just this mesh here. And if this magazine is inserted, because it's an attachment, once it's attached to the gun, it becomes part of the gun, and not only will it activate its own hovers, it will also activate any of its attachments hovers, which would include the magazine. So the magazine does also show up, and that's how that's sort of customized. So the hovers I've been through in a different video, in the VR interaction video. You just reference it, each renderer, and you can set whether you want it to change just the shader, or you can change it to material, and it will just choose the default material and hover material. Default material, obviously, you can most of the time leave that blank unless you definitely need to fix it, but it's just going to, during its initialization, whatever material's currently on, or whatever shader's currently on, is the one it will use. And by default, if you leave any of these blank, it will use the unlit texture shader for the hover shader. And if you actually set it to material and leave it blank, then I think that might actually be a blank material. But by default, it's just left to shader. and it just uses the unlit until you actually got something you want to replace it with. Okay, so next we have prefabs. In this case, we just have a muzzle flash that shows up here. If we click Setup Position, you can see that it spawns. So this is just a prefab that we got in the scene here, in the project here. And you reference any number of effects that you want to happen when you fire the gun. And then you can set the position you want it to go. And it's kind of a fire and forget system. So this will make the prefab show up. In order to get it to go away, I've added a little destroy on script. So you can see this is an instance of that prefab, and it's got a little destroy in script with 0.1 seconds on it. All of these are added via a pooling system, so it's quite smart in that it adds it and then doesn't get rid of it completely. And this is set to disable because it's a pool object. It will actually just instead of actually destroying it, it will put it back in the in an inactive state. And then if it's called again and it's ready, it will spawn again. And it also has a little fade script here. This is just a little quick script I wrote just to have the fade in and fade out. It just makes it look a little bit nicer, and it just has a little light on there as well. And the actual mesh is just these simple little planes, simple mesh planes and cones with these materials on it. And that's all that is. Okay, so when you've positioned it, you can click save, and it'll save that position that it was in on these variables here, and that's the spawns. For the bullet, now this top one, the damage method name, so that's the method of the receiving object. So for instance, these little targets we have over here, they're actually using a script called example target, and all example target's doing is has variables here for up rotation and down rotation. So when it's hit, it will just iterate between these. It says how long it'll take and how long it'll take to reset. And you can see that it has a method right here called damage, and it just takes a float. So if you have a script called damage, or maybe in your particular project that you're using, you've got an asset where enemies take a script called, say, apply damage, right? So say you've got an asset and it says, the damage script looks like this, apply damage. All you have to do is go into your editor right here, and instead of it be saying damage, you just change that to apply damage. And now, because it still takes a float, that will now work. Also, if for instance, and this is on a per gun basis, right? So if you have a damage script, you might have another method on every object called damage laser, right? And if you have damage laser, you can have one method called damage, like this, and you could have another method called damage laser. So now only weapons that are set to send the damage laser method will call this one, and normal ones will call this one. So you can use that to customize your effects, maybe your receivers, maybe something completely unique to your game that's not something simple like just the damage number, right? And yeah, that's how that works. The fire type, so we've got two types. We got physical and raycast, and they're pretty much as I might expect. The raycast is a simpler one. It literally just draws a line from the shoot origin in the shoot direction until it hits a collider. Again, using the layer from damage raycast layers in order to decide what it actually hits. And it will just spawn whatever the decal prefab is. And in our case, I actually have a prefab called decal changer, and all that does is check the tag, you see, the tag of the object that it hits, to decide what prefab it's going to spawn. So the decal changer script, basically how that works is you have your default decal on the parent here, and it will spawn the default decal unless the tag of the object it's hit matches one of these in the elements, in which case it will spawn the alternative prefab. So you can use that to specify things like metal walls or grass floors, and have a big list of decal prefabs that you can use here. So in our case, I actually have the walls are just normal, but these actual targets, you see that the tag is actually marked as respawn. Just because that's one of the base ones, but obviously you could have named your own and called it, target or metal target or something. You can see that the decal changer uses the respawn tag and spawns the alternative one. In our case, This one is just like yellow sparkles and sparks, and this one is like randomly coloured, rainbow coloured sparkles, and that just sort of differentiates the two different surfaces. Okay, if you're going to use a physical bullet, however, it'll ask for a prefab, and in this case we have an example one called physical 9mm, and we can drag this into the scene to have a look at it. Okay, so it actually uses this this line renderer here. So the physical bullet is an empty parent, and we have just a mesh, which we're using here, just this mesh. The physical bullet script, which is the most important one, and we've got this trail as well. It's just a line renderer, and it has this little don't hide script. That's a script in reference to the physical bullet that is basically telling it not to hide it when it hits a target. So what's going to happen when the physical bullet script hits a surface, it's going to try and make itself invisible, and that makes sense for the actual bullet itself, but for the trail, it wants to keep that present. And so the trail has this little don't hide script on it. It's an empty script, it does not actually got anything in it, and it just marks the object, the render in this case, as not something to be hidden, so that the trail actually still persists for a few seconds while it catches up to the bullet itself. Otherwise the bullet just the bullet and entire trail disappear all at once, and it doesn't look that great. So the physical bullet, it's a pretty simple script. Just like most of the others, it wants to know what the root is. It can be itself, of course. If this has the mesh renderer and trail all on the same object, then you could just say the bullet root is itself. But in our case, we split them up into separate objects. Then it wants to know how fast it's going to move through the world. In which case we've set 100 as our default speed. It's quite a fast speed. You can set this to be a bit slower. Maybe if you're going for like lasers from Star Wars or something, then that would be more like 5 or 10 speed. It's max lifetime, so because this bullet moves really, really fast, that's quite a small time, 3 seconds. If we're flying at 100 speed for 3 seconds, then we're going to be quite far away from the player, in which case we just give up on the bullet because we don't want it flying off forever. But if you were to have like a much slower speed, then you'd want to massively increase this max time, because otherwise the bullet will just be disappearing. And then how long this object is going to exist for after it's hit something. So for instance, you may have a particle effect on hit that lasts a few seconds. In this case, we don't have really much except for the trail. So we've got 1 second to make sure that the trail ends. But if you had some like big explosion or big thing and you want it all to be self-contained in this object, then you can add this to this timer and the object will persist for quite a bit longer after it's already hit something. Okay, so that's how that works. And so that's just referenced right here as a physical bullet. So this decal will be just passed on to the physical bullet script. So whatever you put in this physical bullet slot, it just has to make sure that it has a physical bullet script on it. Otherwise it won't work. And this decal will just be passed on to that bullet. So it works exactly the same behavior-wise as raycast, except you just have this additional little prefab. And you can just use this existing prefab and change the mesh and a few of the stats on that physical bullet script, and then you've got a new bullet and it'll work quite well. So now we have a few toggles. This will change the behavior quite significantly for how the bullet's going to work. We can not have a chambered bullet, so I'm pretty sure that the laser one doesn't have it doesn't have a chambered bullet because it has an integrated magazine and doesn't even have a slide. So for a more simple weapon, you can skip the chambered bullet completely. You can actually still have an external magazine, but just not have a chambered bullet, in which case there would be no slide or loading. You just put the magazine in, and if there are bullets in the magazine, it would just fire. Whereas when your chamber bullet is ticked, you have quite a bit more complicated setup, in which the bullet is being loaded into a chamber, and then the chamber can be ejected or fired. So most guns do use a chamber, but for a really simple arcadey one, you could just not use it. Eject firing on casing. So every time you shoot the bullet, does it want to immediately eject that casing? In the case of this, it doesn't even have bullets or ejection, but in case of the M9, of course, it does. It does eject it on fire. If you can also eject it on pull, so Ejecting it on fire will work just like this pistol works, but this bolt action rifle and this pump shotgun, they have eject sliding on pull. So that just means that when the casing is there, so that just means when it fires, it'll do nothing but fire the gun and just hold on to the casing until you eventually pull the slide, and then it will actually eject. Now we got the two scripts, one for the actual loadable bullet. This is the actual armed real bullet that you can pick up and load into a receiver, and the spent bullet, this is just sort of a simplified version of that bullet. Usually you can just not pick it up, and usually you have a timer on it for it to blow up. So for this loadable bullet, we can have a look at the prefab here. So for instance, these are an example of that, these shells. So we'll just get rid of this. On the parent object, we actually have the box collider and the rigid body on the same object. So normally I tend to put the box collider as a separate object, but in this case, I guess I just decided to put them on the same parent object, I guess because it's not a very complicated thing. I have separated out the mesh though. And the loadable bullet script, you can see that this is the interactable item stuff right here. And then the only addition thing that the loadable bullet has is an ID. So it uses the bullet ID for the receivers to match up with receivers. And we'll look at IDs in a bit when we get to attachments. In addition to that, unlike most of the scripts, it actually does require a trigger collider on the same object as the loadable bullet, and this collider is what it will use to collide with the receiver collider in order to actually get loaded. And the spent bullet casing, so we'll look at that. In this case, obviously we're actually using the same mesh, but it doesn't have to, and obviously in the case of a shell, you would probably use you can use a spent casing mesh for the second one. We got a pretty similar setup, except we've added an addition of a destroy in script, and I've actually added an interactable item to this as well. And I think the shell does actually require an interactable item in order to be loaded. So if you eject on fire, then the casing is never actually in the gun, it's just immediately ejected, in which case it can literally just be a rigid body with a mesh. But in the case of a pump shotgun like this, the gun's actually going to hold on to the casing for a bit inside the gun. If that's the case, you do need to have an interactable item script just to make sure that it has the VR item collider script on it, which references that item and makes it a parent of the overall object. Otherwise, this rigid body will conflict with the rigid body of the parent object, and you'll end up with them going flying crazy when you just after firing your first shot. So you're gonna make sure if the casing's gonna be inside the gun, it has to be an interactable item. And you can see the setup for this. It's just the interactable item on its own thing. This is just the mesh, and the parent is just the rigid body. Okay, and that's how that works. Okay. So going back to where we were. We're at spent bullets. So once you've specified your two prefabs, you can actually specify where they should appear. So the actual loadable bullet, this is asking for basically where the chamber is. If you've got use chamber bullet, you want to know where that's going to be. So you click setup position, it will spawn you an instance. You see here, it's spawn you an instance of this loadable bullet prefab in the scene. And in my case, I have it right here in the slide. I can click on the slide here and toggle it down. You can see that that's where it appears in the gun. And the spent casing will also appear in the exact same position. You're choosing the position for both. And then you can click Setup Injection Position, which you'll see has added a little bullet origin and bullet direction spheres. You can't change the bullet origin because that's just going to match whatever this position is, the casing position. And the direction is going to be which direction out of the gun it wants to fire. Okay. You also have this little variable here called ejection push. Now, sometimes this position that the bullet is in can be too far into the gun, right? And when it tries to eject, it actually hits the collider that makes up the gun and ends up just falling flat or flying millions of miles away. It's super fast. And so what you have is this little ejection push variable, and that will basically skip a little bit of distance to make sure it ejects cleanly every time. So if you're having an object that's quite far in and there's a bunch of colliders around it, and you're finding that the ejection bullet's not actually quite getting out, you can increase the ejection push number, and then you've got more chance of a nice smooth exit. The bullet ejection direction is also, the distance is taken into account, so if you move it all the way over here, it's going to eject with more force than it would if it was here. So if you want it to fire out really fast or just slightly drop out, then the distance of the ejection direction sphere, that's the variable for that. Okay. Bullet receiver. So if you can load the bullet straight into the gun like you can with this, then this is the bullet receiver. You see it's just placed right over the slide. I know a lot of shotguns are set up in such a way that they have little a little thing down here, and if you did have that, you could just move this collider here, a little flap where you put the actually put the bullets in. You just move it like here, and that would match that pretty well. And you can just resize this. All this is a collider with a bullet receiver script on it. And now bullet receivers, they can have they can be attached to a few different things. This one's attached straight to the gun handler, but you can have a bullet receiver on the magazine, and that would reference just the magazine. And then this is an ammo pack over here, that just has bullets on it, if you had that. Okay, the next thing is bullet ID. So this is the ID of the receiver. So you saw before that the loadable bullet was set to 5 on its script. Bullet ID is set to 5, and that matches this receiver that is also set to 5. And the other guns are set to different numbers, which is why you can't load a shell into, an M9, because the IDs don't match. Now you can add a few lines here. We got tracer lines and laser pointers. So this object at the beginning here, this uses a laser pointer. Right here, it just asks for a material, and when you've given it one, it'll ask for how thick you want the line to be. And in this case, the material is just this little red material, but you can make it literally anything you want. It's just asking for any material to be that renderer. And it has this little boolean enabled. You could disable this and it'd be permanent. This is kind of exposed just so that it's to show that you can change it at runtime. So you can, for instance, attachments can override the laser pointer setting. Okay, and you can also set tracer rounds. So an example of a gun that uses tracer rounds is the shotgun. In order to show the spread of the, I use that in order to show the spread of the shot. And so it just uses this, and again, it just asks for a material and its thickness, and that's all you need for that. We have a few sounds here. These are just sounds for the gun. Fire, dry fire, slide pull, and slide release. All of them use the same sounds in my asset, but they can be any clip. So obviously you can customize what noises you want everything to make. There's usually sound slots for most things. And then down here we just have the fact that all the guns inherit from interactable items, so we have all the interactable item variables here for how you actually want the item to act when you pick it up and such. At the bottom here, I've written a bit about each of the parts, so so you can reference this if you know what you want to look for, if you're not sure about something, and you can close that door. Okay, we'll move on to the slide. Slide works the exact same way as the trigger, except we have a whole bunch of toggles here about how we might want the slide to actually operate. And we'll just go through each of them. So we're on the pump here. So animate when firing. That's something that will be true for the M9. That just means that it's going to go from its default position to its pulled position every time you fire in a little animation. So it's not an actual animation, it's literally moving through the script, these two positions, back and forth in order to animate that. The slide spring, it's true in all the guns except for this bolt action rifle. All that means is when you let go of it, it's going to try and get back to the default position as fast as it can. Lock slide back, so I've got tooltips for most of these, so if you're not sure about something, try hovering over and it should tell you a bit more about it. So this is if the slide is even capable of locking back, and the default behavior is that if there's no bullet, then it locks back. But an additional behavior to that is that it'll only lock back if the slide, if the magazine is actually inserted. So originally when I did this, I just had this first variable here that just said, if we're out of bullets, then lock back no matter what. But I found that a lot of real guns actually, they have a catch for whether the magazine is there or not. And if the magazine is there, then it's the only situation it actually will lock back. Otherwise, it'll always just move freely. And so I've got this little toggle here. So on this shotgun, it can slide back, but it uses an integrated magazine, so that's just set to false. But on, say, the M9, which is set up probably the most realistic weapon of the ones here, we do have that ticked, so that it'll only lock back if the magazine is actually inserted still. Second held position, so the pump is an example of a weapon that uses the second held on the slide. So obviously we can make a second held position here, which is just here. But we can also make the slide the second held position, and if we do that, then it will work like the shotgun, where you're holding both the slide and you're holding the second held all in one object. Toggle to pick up, it's just the same as a normal interactable items toggle to pick up, so that's whether or not you're holding the button down the whole time you're holding the button, or whether you could just sort of tap it and then you tap it again to let go. Toggling is tapping, and so most of them are set to false. I feel like it feels really sticky if a second held is set to toggle, but you can choose that if you want. It's totally up to you. You can just set that right there. Use scale calculation. Sometimes, depending on the mesh and how the whole thing's set up, this can just be a bit better. This is just sort of one. If the slide isn't working right, it's not animating properly, then you can just tick this, untick this, and see if it makes a difference. It sometimes fixes problems. These positions work the same as they do for the trigger. So you can toggle this back and forth, and you can see that it's the current position and the pull position, just like the trigger. And the only other thing is that these extra positions, so if we check the bolt action, which is the weapon that uses multiple positions for its slide, you can see that that's actually ticked, and you can just choose an array here of how many extra positions there'll be. In this case, it's just the one. So the default position is it's down. Its second mid position is just straight up. So we can move to slide to index. You see that the slide actually moves up like that. And then we can move to, we can toggle between the far bit. So we can click and click, and it shows the whole transition that it's going to move down. And you can add as many middle positions as you want to have some kind of weird complex slide if you'd like to have that. And then obviously the slide still does use interactable item, although it's locked down a bit so that you can't pick it up. But you can still choose things like the interaction distance from it, and you can still add a list of interaction colliders if you're not quite being able to grab it quite right. You can customize how the interaction colliders work. And there's another video that shows you the base VR interaction tutorial video will show you about interaction colliders and interaction distance and how that can be customized. For this project, I pretty much don't use them for anything. It just uses interaction distance for almost everything in this whole project, and everything seems to work quite nicely just with that. Okay, so that's the slide. Again, we have a little help box at the bottom here, but that tells you a bit more about stuff going on that page. Trigger is literally just the same as what you'd find on the actual trigger script. So if you check the trigger script, you can see that it actually just matches one-to-one. Just copy and paste of it's just showing the same menu in the editor. Okay, so for attachments, the first thing you need to check with attachments is your actual gun handler attachment ID, which shows up right here at the top. This wants to be unique for the gun type. So this is the ID that everything will be passed against. So if we check first, have a look at some of these. Let's have a look at one of these attachments. So let's see the scope here. So you see that on the top, it just looks like a typical VR interactable item. I've once again put the box glider on the actual parent object of the rigid body, but that can be just, these two can be on its own object as long as it references the actual VR interactable item script. And again, this is the VR attachment script. It, just like this little bar tells you, this is the VR interactable item, and the attachment inherits from the interactable item to add these extra variables and extra stuff. So this actual thing is set up where I have a few disabled objects here. Now these represent the zoom levels. So I've basically got these prefabs set up for that. I've got the scope, which is just that's the actual main mesh. A quick little render texture here, which is what I'm using for the so you can see the thing, and it's using also a little like circular mesh. And I've got an extra camera here, which is what the render texture is targeting. And okay, so then we have to look at the actual attachment script. So for this particular one, we have two scripts, main scripts attached, and scope control is the one that's actually in charge of controlling the scope, and everything else is just about being an attachment, and all of the attachments are the same as far as this goes. So at the top, let's just go through these variables. We have show highlights. So for these ones, that uses a hover highlight, which is ticked right here, and this is where you can choose the material you're going to use for the highlight material and for ready to attach material. So just as you saw in the other demo of this of the weapon interactor, the highlight material, it's just the same mesh but using this material, and it will use this one when you actually are hovering the attachment over its receiver. You'll show this material, and you can customize these materials to be whatever you want. I just have a slight little transparency gray and transparency green just as a demonstration purposes. But as an example of something that doesn't use the highlight is all of the magazines. Okay, so this magazine right here is also an attachment, but the VR magazine script inherits from attachment. You see that with the line again, separating the information, and you see this is the attachment variables, and you see show highlight is actually set to false, and that's because it doesn't show a version of it. So you can make an attachment that doesn't show that, and I'll show you where the slide is in a second. Okay, so after that is this sound. So obviously it may you can make it make a sound when it does it, and you can also make it invoke events on attach and detach. So you could add your own script to this, and if you had some custom behavior you wanted to happen or trigger from attaching it or detaching it, then you can trigger that from here. Okay, now is the part about compatibility. So actually this is just for reference, because this isn't where you actually modify it, but for reference you can see that this weapon is compatible with the AKM and the bolt action rifle, which are these two weapons right here. And these just show a few variables, but you actually can't modify this, and so it's compatible with both these weapons. Now that's just for reference, just to see what it's a part of, and you can always click clear references here, which will just literally make this blank again and make you start from a clean slate. So if you have your weapon that you want a new attachment to be compatible with, you can go to its attachments tab here, and these are all the attachments that the particular weapon is compatible with. So you can see that this has an ID of 5, and if we check if we go ahead and check the attachment script again, you can see in the reference here, when it references the AKM, it's using gun handler ID 5 and receiver attachment 3. And then if we look on our list, we have scope, receiver ID 3. So as long as all those things match, then it's set up correct. Okay, if you want to actually modify one of these, you can click edit attachment, and that will instantiate an instance of your thing and show you all of the toggles you can change here. So for instance, if it was a magazine or if it was a slide, it doesn't have to be a magazine to use the slide, but if you tick slide, then you'll see that it actually has an entry position and default position. So this doesn't use a slide, this just snaps into place. But for, say, this magazine on the attachment section, we can see that it does use the slide, and we can actually toggle the two positions, and you can see them changing there. And all you'd have to do if you wanted to change it is move it, say, to if you wanted to be back here, save as current, and you see it saves it, and you see that the little load there was it actually applying this prefab. It actually has to deparent it, apply the prefab, and then reparent it, just because in this version of Unity we don't have multiple prefabs within prefabs. Okay, so then we can move this we can move this back to where it was and save that again. We have auto load. So auto load is, if you, just like the tooltip says, if you let go of the attachment halfway into its slide, then will gravity make it drop, or will it just continue to load all the way up? And for certain things, like if you had a magazine on a belt that's on your character and you wanted to be able to just lower the gun and have it immediately load without having to worry about it, then you could tick this auto load and it'll ask you how quickly it wants to auto load into the gun. And that way you can have the gun just sort of move close to the magazine and it'll just immediately get loaded. and that kind of makes it a bit nice. It's like kind of an arcadey sort of a little addition there. We've got some sounds here. These are some of the overrides, so you can add a laser pointer override and the shoot direction override, and you can also override the sound the gun makes. So for instance, this little silencer here, if we go to the AKM that uses the silencer, you can see it's right here, and you can see that on new fire sounds it's actually overridden that to use the silenced fire sound, so it sounds like it's got a silencer on it. And that's just an example of an override you can use. Now, if it's just an attachment, then that's all the options you get, is that you can choose how you're going to slide on, and either it's going to snap or it's going to slide. And then if you're going to use one of these overrides, and then for additional behavior, so for instance, this silencer, that's all it does. But for, say, the torch, it has its own like internal behavior using this additional script to toggle the flashlight on and off. And you see this is going. So this actual flashlight isn't compatible with the rifle. You see it only has one, and it's the AKM. That's all it's compatible with. So the scope was compatible with both, but the torch in this case only can slot onto the AKM. So if you wanted to, so let's do that now. If you take your torch, so we can go to our bolt action rifle. Say we want to have a torch attachment. We want the torch to be compatible. You can go in here and you see that right now it's compatible with its magazine and it's compatible with the scope. So if we add a new attachment receiver by clicking this button right here, the first thing it's going to do is add ourselves a big old box collider just set to 111, and it's going to reference it right here. So first thing we'll want to do really is resize this to be how big we want it to be. So let's say we want to put the flashlight right here under the barrel. And let's just make sure we're not overriding the second held position. So that is right here. So we want to be just a bit closer. Let's say, no, that's further away. We want to be a bit further away. So right here on the sort of tip for now. So if we move the torch there, then we want it to attach. So we want to set a new receiver ID. Now the receiver ID here is actually just of all the colliders on this one gun. So this gun handler attachment ID is for all guns in all of the scenes, but this receiver ID is actually just to the attachments on this object. So as long as it's not 0 or 4, then it won't override. So if we just set it to 1 for now, then we know that it's unique. This is the only one that has to be unique across all guns. Then this is just with this one gun. Okay, so then we want to mention our prefab, which in this case is the torch. That's what we're setting up, which is right here. So we just drag that on, and now we can immediately see that we have a couple options. One is the start loaded. So sometimes, like the M9, you'll want to have start loaded set to false, so it's empty. But the AK has its magazine set to auto load set to true. So right at startup, it will already be loaded. In our case, we'll still set it to false because we've got a torch right here and we want to attach it ourselves at the beginning. So we go edit attachment, and now it's going to instantiate this at 111, which isn't the right position. It's not where we want it to be. We actually want it to point this way for 1, so we want it minus 90 degrees, and then we're going to move it up to where we expect it to, where we put the receiver. So right here, so that's where it's going to show up, and that's what it's going to look like when it's attached. So now we've positioned it in the scene, we can just click Save Current as Default, and we can see that it's saved the position right here, and we're not using a slide. We can have a look at the other options. So obviously its highlight thing is customized to it, so that's on its script, and it's already set up here in the attachment. It's already set up to use its highlights itself, and we don't want it to override any behavior, so that's it, that's all set up. And we can close that down, and it'll destroy the instance. And now that torch is compatible, and we can check that it's compatible by going on it here and seeing its attachment references. We see now it's got 2, and bolt action is its second one. I'll quickly go into in-game here, and we'll see that actually working. Okay, so we've got our gun here, and we've got our torch. And we can see that the little highlight here is on, and we can see that it uses our 2 behaviors. And we can also see that the little switch on and off is actually still working, just as we'd expect it to. and it still works on its own, and of course it still works with the AKM. Great. Okay, so that's set up. I think that's pretty much covered the attachments and how that works. Obviously, you can drill down into this and check these scripts for yourself. That does the attachment toggle. It's pretty simple. It just uses the buttons on the VR input. So on the controller here, you can see I've set the thumbstick up, left, down, and right to buttons 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see I put the little like tooltip down here that tells you that I've already set it up. That button 1 does this, button 3 does that, and you can customize that in the script. It's just the names of the methods is all this is. And they show up because they're written here as strings. And so this is it's pretty open-ended and customizable. And I've shown pretty good examples, I think, in this scene for how that's set up. Okay, let's set up a brand new weapon from scratch, just so we can see that whole process and how that works. So let's say we have ourselves a gun. Let's use one of our models here, though. So let's just use the M9 model again. Yeah, so this is just the base model, and we'll leave it untextured, why not? Just to show that it's sort of our example here. So this is just a model, it's got an empty parent, and these are just meshes, and that's it, that's what we're starting with. So the first thing you want to do when setting up a new weapon from scratch, from just a mesh, is we want to use our VR weapon interactor weapon wizard up here. We also have one for the bullet. That's the loadable bullet, not the physical bullet. And the weapon wizard is just going to ask for a few different variables to set up with. So we're going to say the gun root, and we can say that the slide is this mesh, and we can say that we have a trigger, and that's this mesh, and we say that we have a magazine, and that's this one. Now, obviously, you may have noticed that even right at the beginning here, we've got no setup button, but if you just assign the root, we can immediately actually set up the weapon. So for instance, this arcade gun over here, it doesn't have a slide, it doesn't have a trigger, and it doesn't have a magazine. I mean, it does physically have them in this mesh, but I've not used any of them. So you can have really, really simple weapons that have like no moving parts, super simple arcadey base weapons, or you can specify all the stuff if you have a mesh that has it, and you want to use it all. So in this case, we're going to use everything and click setup. Now that's going to get us all the way to the gun handler window and its initial setup. Now we're actually in a position pretty close to being able to just work right away. You'll notice it's done two things. We've got our gun still in the scene, and it's added a rigid body and a gun handler ref to its parent object, but we've also been given here a magazine object. Now the magazine object, what we want to do with that is save it as a prefab for us to be able to reference in a bit. So if we reference this as a brand new prefab here, and then that's the magazine, the base magazine there. And we can delete that now. So what we want to do for that is set up its held position first, and when we've done that, we want to set up its shoot direction. That's probably the most important thing you want to set up for it to actually function. And again, you see the two spheres, I just select both of them, put them across the thing, and then the direction is over here. And then I hit save, and that gets you the shoot direction nice and quick. Everything else is just like we've gone through and is able to customize it all you want. Slide's already set up. You just need to actually set its current position, then set its pull position, and then you can toggle between those, and that's that setup. Trigger, just the same. You got its current position, then you can move it to its pull position, which would be something like this. And then you can toggle between those, and that's that done. And attachments, it doesn't have any attachments, so we can add the magazine that we've made a prefab of. So we can just move this down here to be like this, just on the channel where the magazine will go as the receiver. And we can set this to be some unique number that's not going to be the same as any others. And in the prefab, we can use our object that it made and spawn that in. You can see that its position it's just its default prefab 0 position is actually correct. So we can make it use the slide, set that as its current position. Then we can move this down to be its slide position, set its entry, toggle, works, move between the positions. Its bullet ID, it's not going to use bullets for this one, but the setup's just the same as it was before. Yeah, so magazine, we haven't actually gone through a lot of these settings. Okay, so the magazine, bullet ID, so this is for its internal receiver. So for instance, these magazines, you see that they have a bullet receiver, and they have their bullet receiver set to that ID, and the magazine script has a bullet ID that it's expecting, so that it wants bullets with ID of 1, and these little 9mm bullets here, their loadable bullet has a bullet ID of 1. Unlike, say, the shells that had an ID of 5, and that's why they're compatible with each other. So that's what that bullet ID is. Infinite ammo is just on a per magazine basis, so you can set it to be infinite ammo for all of them, or you could set it to be, so for instance, if we check this AKM here, so we see here it actually has 2 set up, one for the normal AKM and one for the infinite ammo. And we've actually ticked start loaded on this, as long as they're not both ticked, because if they are both ticked, then obviously you'll have an infinite ammo magazine and a normal magazine loaded at startup, and they'd overlap each other, which isn't ideal. So obviously, as long as they're not both ticked, then both of these magazines are now made capable, and you can see that their setup is such that this toggles in this position using this receiver, and this also toggles in the exact same position. But you notice that they both use separate receivers, these 2 receivers right here, but they're both literally copies of each other. They use the same positions, just the attachment ID is different. And so that's a way you can make sure you can have multiple magazines, and some of the magazines can work differently if you'd like, and have different, completely separate settings. So this one, the only difference I think on this one is that one has infinite ammo ticked and one doesn't, but you can customize each magazine to be completely unique. So you could have one gun, but the magazine completely controls how that gun behaves. Okay, going back to our base little gun here, we're already set up. So let's give that a little run. So you can see that we can pick it up, and you see that actually the default behavior, I accidentally dropped it there. The default behavior is actually for it to be not on toggle pickup, but you can see that it doesn't have its magazine, and I did set it to have its magazine. But you see that slide works. The default setting is for the slide to be pulled back but not require a magazine, so you can actually pull the magazine back and it locks into place because there's no magazine. That's right. But everything does work, and the gun does shoot if it has ammo. I'll spawn some ammo in. So there's some ammo for us to shoot. So that's the magazine that was made, just the default magazine. So we pick that up, and we pick our magazine up, and we see that the slide does work just like we set it up. And then once it's done, there we go, we are actually shooting. You can see that it's shooting and that the thing's there, but we didn't reference a decal, so it's not showing up. We also haven't referenced the muzzle flash, so that doesn't show up either. But the animate while shooting is ticked. Magazine while shooting is ticked, so that does show up. How you'd expect. Now let's have a go at switching one of the existing weapons model. So let's take this bolt action rifle that we've got in the scene here and move it into a more central position here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a model from the Chamfer Zone package asset called the Sacco 85 Hunter rifle, and we're going to use this rifle's model and swap over all of the mechanics from this working gun over to this nice looking model. Now the process should be pretty much the same no matter what the model is. All we're going to do here is change the visual part. So let's start by making sure they're over the top of each other. So we've got both our things here in the scene. Let's drag it down here so we can see it. Copy its position in the scene and paste it over the new weapon. So now we're starting from a pretty good position where you can see that they're overlapping quite a lot. Down here we have our current rifle, and we have just the mesh renderers. So let's start dragging down the main meshes from our model down to the functioning weapon. So the bolt handle is the slide, and so we'll take our slide that's right here, and this is our old slide mesh. So we'll move the bolt handle down to be a child of our slide. The magazine we'll do separately at the end because the magazine is external. The safety is just part of the main thing. The scope we can use as an attachment. So let's move the scope stuff down to be unparented. In fact, let's make it its own object down here called Hunter Scope, and just move that out of the way for now. And we'll also take the magazine and move that down, and we'll make a new empty object for that as well, and we'll call this Hunter Magazine. And we'll also move that out of the way for now. So we have some bullets in here, and we'll also move that away because we can use the bullets separately. Second one's not needed. And we've got the trigger, which is just the same as the trigger here, so we'll swap that down. And that's everything from the old one swapped over. So now we've got the so now we can just do some lining up. So you can see we've got both our pistols here. We can, or in fact, what we can start to do now is delete the original mesh. So we can delete the old barrel here, and we can delete the old mesh here. We can go to the trigger and delete the old trigger, and we can go to the slide and delete the old slide. So now visually, we've got our current gun, but we just need to do a little bit more lining up. So for instance, the trigger here. So what we can do is, because I don't like this big offset, is we can move this so that the pivot position is a lot closer to it, and then move this back so it's back into position, which is about here. And then we can set that to be the current position, the default position. Then we'll give it a little rotation. Put it up here. And set that to be there. See that the toggle's working. That looks about right. And then for the bolt action, for the slide, we've got the slide up here. And we can configure this from here. Or we can also configure it from the slide tab. We can configure it from here, so let's try to do that. So this is going to be the new default position. In fact, we've got the same situation where the offset's a little bit off. So let's just drag this and put it back over here so that the positions are a bit closer to how they actually are. And let's just check how it was, and it was back here. And then line that back up, like so. And then we can set that to be the default position. Then the up position was just this nozzle up, so we can remove it into that position now. It was up like this, and then the position was actually about the same for the rotation, so something like that. Then we can set that to be the middle index, and then you can pull back on it into its pull position. It looks like it would catch on this little piece right here. So we can click set current to pulled there, and that's set that into position. Now we can toggle between all of the places, so we can move straight through and then back through the entire slide positions. So this works just the same as it did work before. All we've done is readjusted the actual positions of the slide. So one of the last things we need to do is make sure we set up our hovers for the new slide as well. And we'll have a look at the second held position, the second held collider. And I'll move that more to be where you'd expect it to find it on this particular gun, which is about there. So with things like the second held, you just want to position them into place and then make sure you click the setup held position and actually make sure that the controller is over where you actually want it to go. So you'll move the whole gun away. This one was positioned just over here, and I just did it before. And you move the entire gun over where you actually want it to show up. And the same thing for the slide. In this case, this weapon, this slide here. We want to just go down to setup held position again, and you want to move it so it's like this. So it'll weirdly move off like that, but you don't have to worry about that. All that matters is the actual slide and the controller. So whereas in reference to the rest of the gun in this point doesn't make a difference. So you just want to make sure that the controller is actually over the over the little sphere, which is where you would grab it. Something like this, just like how it was set up there, just about there, so that when you move the controller there, that's where it's looking for, and you just hit save there, and you see it actually moves back into position where you'd expect it to be. And one last point is on the second held collider, there's a little boolean here called can be held. If you want to be able to hold the whole gun by just the slide, like I'd done for the demo there, so I can hold this, so I can manipulate this with my trigger hand, then you have to tick can be held. If this is not ticked, then if you let go of your trigger hand, the whole gun will be dropped no matter if you're holding the second held or not. So with that done, we can look at the current receivers that we have on here. So this one is for the scope, which is actually positioned about right. And the second one, in fact, this position probably can be a little bit longer now because I think the scope that we set aside, this one, I think that sits somewhere about here, doesn't it? So if that's where it sits, then we'd want to move our receiver so that it's over that position. And that would be something like this. Maybe a little bit over to the side. So that would be the receiver for the new scope. And we did set up the flashlight to work. So we can just leave that as it is for now, since that's just for demo purposes. We'll move the scope away, we'll do that in a second. Okay, and we'll also look at the magazine receiver. So the new magazine receiver will just be positioned right here. Okay, so now that the magazine is positioned correctly, we can actually change the magazine prefab. So the magazine that the bolt-action rifle used is right over here. And also in the scene, in the project, it is also right here. So we'll get a new instance of this magazine out. And we'll go over to where our model is, our new magazine model that we'd like to use. And just like before, we can take the position of this and we can paste this onto it. Oh no, that's the position of the child object. We want the parent object here. Copy and paste that over. So we see we have a little rotation issue here, which is fine. So all we'll do is the same as before. So we can collapse all this, bring this to the bottom, so they're next to each other again. So this is our working magazine that's currently compatible with this rifle that we've just reskinned. And we want to bring our new mesh over to it. And then we can get rid of our old mesh right here. And we also had a collider right here. And what we can do is this is how I normally separate out the box collider. We can just add a box collider here, and that works just fine. But if you do want to separate it out, and I usually do, just for the sake, like I've done here, I usually make this add this box collider, then I just duplicate this object. So now I have two meshes and two box colliders, and then on one of them I remove the mesh filter and mesh renderer, and on the other one I remove the box collider. And then on this one I can just add my VR item collider script again, hook that up to the thing, hook that up to the VR magazine. The old collider that was the wrong shape, we can delete that. And now this is our new collider object, and this is our mesh, and they're nicely separated out. The bullet receiver, we can just move this into its new position, which would be on top of the gun, which is where you'd expect to receive a new bullet. So the only thing is this collider's slightly wrong. So we'll grab this collider and copy its size and move it over to our trigger collider and paste the new size over. And then we'll copy its transform position as well so that it matches. Now the transform position of the VR magazine object doesn't actually matter very much. All that matters obviously to this script primarily is its root object's position, which is normal. And the VR magazine actual transform position is not going to be used for anything. So this is all the same stats as using before, still clip size 10. We can also update the held position on this magazine, because this position is obviously the old one. And this is all still hooked up to the VR magazine. We've not changed any of that. All we've changed is the actual renderer that it's using. Now, because we did change the renderer, we're going to have to update the hovers drop down. And this is something we're going to have to do for the gun as well, because we forgot to do that. So you span the hovers and you see that now it's missing because we deleted it. All we do is rehook that up with the new renderer. And on the on this gun here, same thing. You go to the gun handler script, the hovers. We see that now we've got 4 empty hovers, and they're actually going to be the same in that it's the slide, go at the bottom, then the trigger is next, then the safety, and the main mesh. So now that the hovers are all set up once again, and we didn't use any interaction colliders on this particular object. So we go back to our magazine, and now we can save this as a brand new prefab so that we can reference it. And then we can delete that instance, and we delete that empty object from before as well. Now we want to set up our section, our attachment section. So open up the editor, attachments, and we see we still have our old references, and one of the references is even gone because we must have deleted it. So for the magazine, that's the old magazine, the one that was this one that's over here that we were using. Now we've made a brand new prefab for our new setup, so we can just replace this and edit attachments. Now we see our position's wrong, so again we'll just reset this position. So we're on 0 here, and we're on -90 here. Now we'll move its position so that it's back to being loaded. I think it might be at +90 instead of -90. So that's its default position about there. And then we can set that to be its default. Then we can move it down to its entry position, save that. Now it toggles between those two positions nicely again. We're using the bullet here, so we can update the bullet. So before it was using this 7062 bullet, and it was using bullet ID 6. So we can update that and make our new bullet here. So we didn't actually move it anywhere. So this is our new bullet. We'll want to take our old bullet, and just like we've done before, we're going to replace it. So we'll copy the position here, and grab our new bullet and paste its position here. They're over the top of each other. Then we can move our new mesh, put it as a child. The old mesh we can delete. So now we're on the same bullet. The collider obviously needs to be a bit bigger, so we'll add a box collider to here. And we'll just leave it on the same object for now. And we'll add the VR item collider on there. And then we'll copy the position, the size of this collider, and paste that onto the script here. So now the trigger collider, this should be a trigger, and the box collider for the bullet is all set up now. And it's still using bullet ID 6, so it's all the same, except we can change this name to be a Cal 308. So it's a brand new prefab. Save that there. Then we can update our prefab on this object. Now we shouldn't have to remove the position, because as you notice there, the positions were actually about the same. So all we should have to do is go into here, and everywhere we reference the old bullet, we can now reference our new bullet. And in the attachments on the rifle here, I think it might be updated already. It is. They share that information. And the top bullet was also visible. So we'll check that, and we see the position isn't quite right in the magazine because we moved the magazine's position. So actually the new top bullet should be positioned more like this. I'm also seeing that the collider looks wrong here in this prefab. Oh, it's actually because there's another collider on the parent object. Okay, we'll fix that in a sec. but that's the position is right. So we'll save current position, and that's it, that's done. Let's have a look at that little prefab there. I really didn't realize that the main collider was actually on the root object, so we can actually just go ahead and remove this box collider completely. And actually we'll want to copy this position, this size, and paste it onto this parent collider. So there we go. So now it's the same size, and we can update that. Great. Now we'll just double check the chambered position. It should be right because obviously the gun hasn't changed shape or size. But we'll have a look. Set up position. Oh, actually, yeah, of course. The bullet hasn't moved, but the actual gun has. So we'll move the chambered position to now be in the new position right here. And we can actually toggle the slide while we're in here just to see how it's going to look. Okay, we save that new position, and the ejection direction is set up still to be directly up, which is fine. Bullet receiver, we can move that so that it's just over the slide, the new slide, and we can move the slide back to its default position. Okay, so looking at it now, I can see that our main colliders need to be updated. So we have our collision colliders here. So we'll update these positions as well to match the new gun shape. Okay, so those actually look pretty good already. Okay, let's carry on with the attachments. So we've actually got a new scope for this one, and this attachment at the bottom here is actually for the torch, although its reference is gone. So we can remove that. And that actually removes the attachment as well. So we can check this scope. That's how it looks now. So actually what we can do is make our new scope, which is just going to be this one. Let's just make it a standard interactable item for now. Or actually it's going to be a VR attachment, which inherits from VR interactable item. And the first thing on any item is that we set the root object. Then what we can do is make this trigger collider the right size. So we can take this, add a box collider to it, copy that position size, and paste that over to our trigger. Make sure it is still a trigger, and also, I guess, change the position, the transform as well. Okay, so now that's our new trigger collider for the receiver, and we are going to use a highlight this time. And we'll use the same highlight material as before, which is trans grey and trans green. Okay, we can name that II, interactable item, or we can name it attachment. We can set this up to be just use a pickup position, and we'll update the hovers list here to have the 3 parts of it as hovers. And we can also add a box collider that's going to act. We can add a rigid body to its parent, and we can add a box collider. In fact, we've already added a box collider. We just need that VR item collider script to it. So now it can act as its body's collider, and we'll leave it on the same object for now. Or actually, no, we'll duplicate it again. We have this. This can be our collider, so we can remove the mesh from here, and then on the mesh, we'll just remove the script and collider. So now they're separate, and that's our new scope item. So we can, so actually I don't like how this it has this offset here. So we'll just move all of this, set our pivot positions about the center. Okay, so now we can save this as a new prefab. This is our new attachment, and delete that. Then in our main gun, we can go back to the gun handler attachments. Here we were using the old scope. We're going to change this to be the new scope. It still have receiver ID 0, it's still all the same. Edit attachment, all we need to do is position it. So it will be this way, 90. Okay, so now that's in place. and it's still going to use the snap position, so we're not going to use these positions, and it's got no overrides. It's just an attachment, so we can save that position as our new position and destroy that, and that should be about it. Now we can make our new bolt action rifle and make that whole object a new prefab, and that's sitting now there in our scene. So let's go in game and see how that works. See that all work. Okay, so here we are in the scene, and I can pick up the gun, and it works just like it did before. So you can see that I have my slide here, and when I'm anywhere near it, it's going to go, and I can grab it, pick it up, move it back, and load our bullet, which is our new bigger 308 round from before. I can also still eject bullets. The magazine under here, I can grab that, pull it out, see that we've got our visible bullet at the top, and pop that back in. I can see that right around here is our second held position, and I can let go of the main hand and hold the whole gun just by the second held, and still maneuver the thing with this hand. We can take a shot. That still works using the exact same flash as it was before. So that all works exactly the same as it worked before. And yeah, great. So that's how to copy a currently existing weapon over onto a new one. But for quite a few weapons, for now it's only the two, I've actually already set up the Hunter 85 rifle and a revolver from the Shameful Zone assets. And I put them in little integration folders, so if you own the Shameful Zone weapons, then you can actually just unpack this little asset right here, and it will actually be the weapon already pre-set up for you, the prefabs already set up, all linked together and everything, so you don't have to do that. Only right now we just have these two, but if you check in future, we'll have set more up, and hopefully we'll eventually end up with a whole bunch of weapons here. And all you need to do is buy the actual model and have it imported, and then the prefab will already be set up for you. But for those that aren't, then obviously that's how to do it. Okay, great. Hopefully I've explained the majority of the things in the scene. I have tooltips spread throughout the entire asset, everywhere I could think of, to try and explain what's happening. You notice on all of these scripts I have written quite a bit about everything. So if you're not sure about something, then make sure to hover over the variable and see if there's a tooltip for it, if you're not sure how something works. And if all else fails, then you can contact me at sam@massgames.co.uk, and I will seek to fix whatever problem you're running into. Okay, thanks for watching.